Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another Daily Highlights. Today is May 20th, and I'm joined by Dr. Stephanie Taylor, and we have a special guest today, Eric Zimmerman. He had done a study at his school analyzing indoor air quality versus test results and versus actual perception of those air qualities. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Eric, and he'll take us through his thesis final report here and see exactly what he had done and how he had done it.
And I just want to say welcome, Eric. Eric is in Switzerland, so we have a transcontinental guest speaker today. We're very
that's
honored.
right. That's right. All right. Hi, everyone. I just want to walk you through my work here. And as Graham already told you, this was my thesis final report that I did at my school in Switzerland. And I looked at the indoor air climate. And I titled my report Indoor Climate Schoolgoers Scourge. So I wanted to find a connection between the indoor air climate and the performance of students and also their well-being. And I analyzed 3 parameters of indoor climate, which was relative humidity, temperature, and the CO2 content. And I did a analysis in 3 parts. For one, I compared my measurements to the national building codes in Switzerland and looked at if they deviate the norms. And the second part of the analysis was I compared the indoor air climate, all 3 parameters, to the students' well-being during that time and their perception of the indoor climate. And the last part of my analysis was I compared their performance in tests to the indoor climate. And I found some really interesting things that I'm about to show you right now. Yeah. So I started off by conducting measurements in 8 different rooms of my school. It's important to say that 4 of these rooms were exam rooms only, and the other 4 were just normal classrooms. None of these rooms had an active cooling system. That's oftentimes not the case in Europe. And 2 of these rooms didn't have ventilation because they were in a provisional building at that time. And I only looked at the school days and school periods. So from 7:30 a.m. in the morning, 5 p.m. in the afternoon. And I'll jump right into my analysis exactly. So in the first part, I compared the measurements to the national building codes in Switzerland. And this is the comparison, or this is looking at the parameter relative humidity. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with this comfort diamond, so to say. So it just shows a zone, depending on the temperature and relative humidity, where the ideal value lies. And this shows one room specifically. And already here we can see that the ideal comfort zone is left in around 80% of the time. And this was a room with ventilation. So that was an eye-opener to start with, just only looking at the measurements themselves, really.
Wow, this is interesting.
All right, and this is the temperature comparison, or the looking at the parameter temperature. And in Switzerland, the indoor air temperature is, the building code is shown as a function of the outside temperature. So in summer, when it's hotter outside, the allowance for the temperature inside does increase, which makes sense if you think about it, especially because we don't have cooling in most of our buildings in Switzerland.
To touch on that, it definitely comes from like an energy saving standpoint as well, right? So
For sure, for sure. Yeah, it's just, I mean, I know I've been to the United States before, and pretty much every building has air conditioning, which can be quite comfortable, really, or just ensures maybe even better indoor climate, but it really comes from an energy standpoint, and most buildings don't need it, I think so.
Also, in the U.S., you know, in the summertime, when I go out to eat, I have to take a sweater because it's actually overly cool in buildings.
I agree. I agree. It's yeah,
that's good. Yeah.
it's sometimes exaggerated a bit for sure. So anyways, coming back to this, can you leave the other slide in for another second?
Yep, sorry.
Sure, yeah. So this is looking at a different room, this time a room without ventilation. So the interesting curve is the upper green graph here, which shows the building code for the temperature. And as we can see, the building code is exceeded, or the maximum value is exceeded in almost 50% of the time. And considering I did my measurements during May and June when the outside temperature really wasn't that high yet, like 90 degrees, 90 Fahrenheit, were never really exceeded in the outside temperature. So considering that the inside temperature rose above, I think, I'm not that familiar with Fahrenheit, but I think above 100 Fahrenheit is very immense, really.
Yeah.
Almost
yeah, I mean, it's definitely getting close to that threshold there.
For sure, for sure. Exactly. All right, and then moving over to the second part of the analysis. It's important to understand that human beings have receptors for things like temperature, like airflow, like heat, of course, but they don't have receptors for relative humidity. So I found that out looking at a couple of studies, and I mean, thinking about it, it makes sense for sure. And so then I conducted a survey with the students. I asked them how they thought the indoor air quality was during their lesson, and I asked them about their well-being, and then I compared those two factors, the well-being and the perception of the indoor air quality, with each other, and I found a clear correlation. So I found out that it definitely has an influence on the students. I also looked at the 3 parameters separately and comparing them, each parameter, like the measurements, to the individual perception of indoor air quality. And I found a correlation for the CO2 content, for the temperature, but not for the relative humidity. Now, this comes as no surprise because, as I said, we do not have receptors for relative humidity. So already there, the science was confirmed, or what I found from my research was confirmed for sure.
So Eric, you're saying that people aren't aware of dry air. They can't.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, but as we will see later, it certainly has an effect on people.
Wow.
All right. In the third part of my analysis, I looked at the personal or individual performance and compared it to each of these 3 parameters. So first, I wanted to find, I went through a couple of scientific reports and studies, and I wanted to find if there was even a connection listed between any of these parameters with the performance. And I found a connection to all of these parameters. So here we see that, for instance, with a increase in temperature, individual performance decreases quite drastically, really. And moving on to relative humidity, here we see the effect of a dehydrated brain, or of dehydration on our brain. Not only is there a contraction of the brain, but also the synaptic activity is quite a bit lower. So, and then one might think that, oh, that's pretty easy to counteract by just drinking water. But the thing is, just drinking water, your body fluids, by regenerating the fluids, it will lag behind. So the relative humidity really is a big factor when it comes to this figure, for sure, or this
And so,
aspect.
Eric, so you're saying that based on your perception studies, that people can have this level of brain impairment, and you're not even aware of the dryness.
That's it. You're not aware of it. You can
Wow.
sense, like, it's maybe important. Well, temperature, obviously, everyone knows. Oh, it's hotter, it's colder. I start to sweat, and that's just, yeah, really intuitive, so to say. But when it comes to CO2, that might be a bit less intuitive. But also, like, a high CO2 level oftentimes results in tiredness, and we feel that the air, like, we talk about stale air, and odors start to come up, and so we also have a perception for the CO2 level, as I said, but not for the relative humidity, but it has a drastic effect for sure.
So one more question. So even by the time a person might feel thirsty and drink air, it's still not going to immediately compensate for this decreased ability to think.
That's absolutely correct, as I said, because by ensuring good relative humidity range, and I defined that between 40 and 60% relative humidity based on several studies I found, is very important to just keep your body hydrated and the brain hydrated, for sure.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Exactly. And so the last parameter I looked at was the CO2 content. And in this graphic, it's very, it shows a lot of things really, but it shows 3 different levels of CO2, 600 parts per million, 1,000 parts per million, and 2,500 parts per million. Now, the outside level where I live is around 400 parts per million. So we're really looking at either industrial areas here or just indoor climate. So, and one might think that a level of 2,500 parts per million can never be reached, with the outside level just being at 400, but that really wasn't the case. During several lessons of my measurements, I found that the CO2 level rose to around 2,500, and especially for this level of CO2, quite drastic decreases in performance of several cognitive activities or capabilities can be found in my research. Yeah, for sure.
Makes me sleepy to look at it.
It does, yeah. All right, and so in this figure, this is where everything comes together really. So I analyzed the performance of students and compared them to all 3 parameters at the same time. And I wanted to find a correlation. So I wanted to find out if bad indoor climate actually decreases performance. And I had to create a point system in order to do that. So I looked at my measurements, and I defined I looked at the research first, and I defined an ideal indoor climate, which I defined to be around 40 to 60% relative humidity, between 22 degrees Celsius and 26 degrees Celsius, and between 400 parts per million and 800 parts per million, or just in general below 800 parts per million CO2 content. And I looked at the deviations of my measurements to this ideal indoor climate. So I added a point for 5% relative humidity below the 40% border. I have to say that the above 60% border was never really exceeded, so that was kind of irrelevant. But below 40% was reached in a lot of cases, for sure. And then I added a point for 4 degrees Celsius below 22 degrees, or 4 degrees Celsius over 26. so too low or too high temperature. And I did the same thing for the CO2 content. For every 400 parts per million above 800 parts per million CO2, I added another point. So here on the x-axis, we see this quantified deviation from the ideal indoor climate for each of those lessons I looked at. And for the same lessons, I asked the teachers to give me those were all test lessons, I have to say. And I asked the teachers to give me the average grade of this class in that test they were writing during that lesson. And I couldn't just straight up compare this average grade to my deviation from the indoor climate, because the test can be, like, the difficulty level of the test can be very different depending on the test, depending on the subject. So I also asked the teacher about the average grade of that class in the subject during the entire year. And I created a deviation, so the deviation in their performance in that specific test to the average grade over the entire year in that subject. And that's what I compared to the deviation of the ideal indoor climate. And it confirms what I found in my research, but I still was surprised to some extent, and for sure happy that I managed to find a correlation between those two factors. So that was very interesting, yeah.
Well, why were you surprised?
Because there's still a lot of different factors that come into a test result, or just individual performance, student performance. Maybe they had some private problems that day and weren't feeling well for whatever reason, so they had a bad grade on the test. But still, I mean, it's an entire class, like 23, 24 people that wrote the test. So the average grade definitely has a meaning. So
yeah, so you were surprised at the power of the environment to impact
for
people?
sure.
Yeah,
Exactly, I was. And so based on what I found, I looked at, could you go back for just a second?
Yep, sorry about that.
No problem. So here on the x-axis, we find a dot at 10. So 10 points deviated from the ideal indoor climate. So one might think that's an outlier, that maybe the measuring device was not working correctly at the time. But I wanted to focus specifically on this test they wrote during that time, and wanted to look at my measurements. And it turns out the measurements were actually correct. So that's what I'll show in the following slide.
Okay.
So exactly. So it wasn't even a warm afternoon. The outside temperature was around 22.64. Wow. That's very precise, but yeah, it was at 22.64 degrees Celsius. And I looked at the room without ventilation, so in the building without ventilation. And they wrote a test in that room on that afternoon around 3 p.m. And I was really surprised by the values. So as you see, the CO2 value, or the CO2 content, goes down at some point. That's represented in the green curve, because they must have opened the window, because it was getting so hot in the room. The temperature almost reached 40 degrees Celsius, which is unbearable, really. You do not want to be writing a test with these conditions, for sure. And what I was really surprised to see, though, was that the relative humidity dropped to like 17%, conditions that are usually only found in winter, in winter time. But this was May 16th to be precise. So yeah, this provisional building definitely did not reach the standards that you would hope for in order to have an environment where, well, good performance is enhanced, for sure. Yeah, I think.
Wow, that's
right.
That's remarkable.
And you can really see that kind of as you hit that 1 o'clock time period, the temperature just starts to rise incredibly.
Exactly. That's when the afternoon sun kind of started shining into the windows. That's one big part. So the exposure of the sun must have heated up that room by a lot. And since there's no ventilation, the conditions could get that bad. And also the CO2 level started to rise because people were sitting inside the room and breathing. So the CO2 level starts to rise. And then at some point they had to open the window. That's why the temperature started to sink slightly, and also the CO2 content, but the relative humidity stayed low. So definitely no conditions to be writing an exam in for sure.
Wow.
Yeah, you can actually see when the students entered on this graph right around at about 2:30.
That was very interesting.
Yeah.
You saw that with the CO2 level, especially usually for all the lessons I looked at, because the room gets crowded, people start breathing, and automatically the CO2 level will rise. And but also the increase in temperature and the decrease in relative humidity is what shows it clearly.
It's a good way to differentiate the CO2 and the temperature and humidity.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, and
did the teacher adjust the grade according to the conditions?
Bell curve based on conditions.
I actually asked the teacher like what went wrong during that exam, because the average grade was rather low, and what she told me was really interesting. She told me that she didn't know what was going on with the class during that test. They were far worse than usual. She really wasn't sure, but she remembered that it was just incredibly hot in the room that afternoon, because that's like the parameter you perceive best for sure. But the other factors just come with it and make it even worse. So she had to adjust the average grade due to that for sure. But it still was lower than usually. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you'll remember when it's 100 Fahrenheit inside the building for sure.
You will, for sure.
Oh, it sounds awful.
Yeah.
That's you have to suffer quite a bit. So yeah, I came to the conclusion that inside buildings, ideal indoor climate should be a temperature between 22 and 26 degrees Celsius, depending on the time of the year. The relative humidity should always be between 40 and 60%, and the CO2 content should never really exceed 800 parts per million.
Yeah, and 22 to 26 is about 72 to 78 Fahrenheit.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that was my conclusion, and then I even gave the school a recommendation what could be done, and I had different ways to look at this, because the financial means of the school they don't want to invest in humidification, cooling. They just don't have the financial means to do that. So one option would be perforated blinders, for sure. That's one recommendation I gave them. Another important thing is to open the windows for a short period of time to just get some fresh air in, but then close it again. Maybe room plants, which would be a kind of cheap alternative, could help a little bit at least. And also that it's important to drink water, even though, as we already saw, it doesn't solve the problem, but at least, I mean, it helps to some extent. And improvements in the ventilation system if they actually wanted to make a financial investment. And I also told them to not keep using room 9113, which was the exam room in the building without ventilation that had those extreme values. To not keep using that room for tests for sure.
Yeah.
This is excellent work, Eric.
Thank you.
I hope you would consider publishing it in, for example, the ASHRAE journal. I think it's a well done study. It's also interesting.
For sure.
There's some research out of the Middle East, showing that when they actually somehow managed to get the students to agree to have their urine concentration tested.
Okay. Wow,
They found that when the children's urine was more concentrated at the end of the day, they had done worse on their academic performance during that school day. So that's sort of like another
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean,
corroboration.
for sure, yeah.
But this is excellent work. I'm really impressed.
Thank you. It was a lot of work, but I'm convinced it paid off in the end, and I was happy to actually find a correlation between those parameters and performance.
Good job.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for joining us today, Eric.
Thank you so much.
And very interesting topic, as Stephanie has said here, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. With that, I just want to remind everyone that Stephanie and I are available for webinars. So if you're an agent of Condair, you can reach out to your RSM. If you're just a regular citizen, reach out to your local agent, and you can find them on our Condair website. In addition, we'll be switching to Fridays only after this week. So we'll have one on Friday this week, and then the following Friday, and so on. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and continue to stay safe. And I hope everyone's healthy out there.
Yeah. Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you again, Eric.
Thank you so much.